Welcome to the Deer Hunter Podcast, a platform created to entertain, educate, and evolve the modern-day deer hunter.
Sierra Matero.
That's how you say it?
Yeah, I think that's the spelling that I saw on Facebook.
Say it again, Phil.
Or that's just, I was trying to type in how to pronounce like someone like spelt phonetically.
Phil?
Or Peter.
Peter. Say his name.
Peter Sierra Matero.
Peter, if that's how your name is pronounced, you have won the TAP suppressor giveaway that we announced on the last podcast.
You lost the name pronunciation, but
Yeah, we were struggling. We didn't want to get your name wrong, but it looked a little tough. But I think we nailed it. I think you nailed it like a split hog.
I think so. They figured they let the Bomberito give it a shot.
Yeah. Okay, Peter. So if you hear this, just message us. Get me your address. You can email me at deerhunterpodcast@outlook.com or message us on Facebook. Get us your address, and we will get that shipped out to you. And thank you very much for participating in the giveaway. And then we have one other winner to announce, and that was for the 100 grain Tooth of the Arrow broadhead giveaway. And those broadheads go to Ted Otten. Ted, you won some broadheads, buddy.
Congrats.
Yeah. Same thing, Ted. If you want to email me, deerhunterpodcast@outlook.com or message us on Facebook at Deer Hunter Podcast and get us your address, we will get those sent out to you. And thank you for all and everyone that participated. And we will get to our regularly scheduled podcast here with Mario Traficante on locating and hunting mature buck bedding. I didn't really want to give up that guest's name, but it was Scott Shaw, which a lot of people that'll listen to this will know who that name is. And I interviewed Scott last week, and we had a 90-minute conversation that was just amazing. And when I went back to check the audio file, it did not exist.
Yeah, same story I had. I was talking to a guy
I
on
was
the
bummed.
beach. Yeah.
So
we had a good laugh as we went through it the second time. But
Scott was so nice, and I was like embarrassed to call him and tell him, like, Scott, I don't know how to break this to you, but that entire podcast that we just recorded didn't record. And he's like, oh, no problem, man. Things happen. Just let me know when you want to do it again. You know, you never know how people are going to react to those type of things. But he is a great guy and a wealth of knowledge. And he's a Michigan guy. He's not too far from me. So what I'm actually going to do to make it up to him is I'm going to travel to Scott at some point, and we're going to sit down together and do it face to face, and we'll get an even better podcast out of it. So
yeah. Good.
So I've been excited to have you on. I guess I'll do a little bit of an introduction as to who you are, and then you can fill me in a little bit better because I know you have a lot of responsibilities, it would seem, but I primarily know you from being the host of the Hunting Beast podcast. That's where I'm most familiar with your voice. And you
Sure.
film with Dan Infalt and help with, I would say, or I would guess, the most of the media that is put out by the Hunting Beast platform, right?
Yeah, I helped him quite a bit just reset up his YouTube channel and get that information out there so he could start posting videos on a regular basis. And really got introduced to the whole Hunting Beast, I think it's going on 5 or 6 years ago now. Fortunately, Dan and I both work at the same company, and it just so happened my group that I work with, we kind of hop around to different plants, and we got located in the same plant that Dan was working. And of course, you know, Dan's reputation precedes him, so anyone that's interested in hunting and so forth sort of finds out that, hey, you might want to go talk to this guy. So it just so happened that where I had to go to get into my office area, I had to walk through the machine shop that Dan worked in. So I was that guy that was kind of bugging him with questions every day, asking him this, that, and through various conversations, him and I started hunting together. And I think, a lot of the practices and the things that I do, obviously we formed a friendship, and I was able to learn a lot. I think my learning curve, because of meeting him and starting to put all those pieces together, obviously really helps, because I had in the field mentoring and tutoring as we were going through these different setups and situations. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I mean, obviously now we just enjoy going out and setting up these different scenarios, and obviously chasing after whitetails is a passion that both him and I have. And we started up the podcast and doing these other things to just get more information out. And it's honestly been a lot of fun, not only getting more information out, but meeting a number of different hunters that have a passion for the sport and are really knowledgeable. I think that helped a lot too, just talking to these guys that are encyclopedias of knowledge on how to track, record, monitor, log, set patterns, map, set up sets on how they go about doing things. That's been a good experience for me.
Yeah, you said something about when you first started working with Dan, you asked him so many questions you thought you might be bothering him, and I have to imagine that was a lot of questions, because Dan likes to answer questions, and he's pretty damn good at it.
Yeah.
When they're deer hunting related, for sure.
Right. And so yeah, it really just formed from that. Obviously, there was a lot of public areas around this place that we're both able to hunt and have access to, and then there's a couple private areas that we both had access to hunt. So, my real first experience hunting with Dan in a specific scenario, or hunting with these beast tactics, was really looking at a piece of property differently than I normally would look at it. I think, I probably wasn't much different than most guys. I grew up, a lot of my hunting knowledge came from my family and what my family did traditionally growing up. And hunting was really putting food on the table for my family. My dad came over from Italy when he was 18 years old. So family originally settled in Chicago. And then around 1970, my mom and him had been coming up to Wisconsin on the weekends to visit other friends and family that were here, but really settled on an area in central Wisconsin that they really liked. And my mom and dad decided they wanted to build a home up there. And my dad and grandfather were always into the outdoors, and mainly they did a lot of hunting of waterfowl and pheasants and rabbits and birds, which was traditionally what they had done overseas in Italy. So a lot of the game, when I was younger, we'd hunt pheasants, we'd hunt rabbits, we'd go out and goose hunt and duck hunt, and we ate everything that we hunted. We'd bring it home, clean it. My mom would cook it up, and that was a regular practice during the hunting season. So my dad really taught me kind of the ways of the woods and what it was about, and there was a camaraderie with family and friends to do that. And when he moved up to Wisconsin is when he first started getting into deer hunting and hunting whitetails. And him and a group of friends, they started doing maintenance on a property, a small farm that was in the area, logging trees, doing other work for the farmer. And then eventually that formed into a partnership, and it was a property that I had hunted on for the majority of my childhood, that along with a variety of, other public spots that were in the area. But so it was on that property that my dad introduced me to bow hunting. Family and friends had traditional gun season that we would do. So yeah, I have some pretty good memories as a kid. I remember, which is interesting for this time of the year, I remember one late summer, my dad and I were up on the property and we were scouting. And looking back then, I realize now that's kind of what we were doing. My dad never really described it in that fashion, but I remember coming up over this hill, and there was a series of oak trees that were lined along one of these fields, and there was a really nice 10-point buck that was feeding below these oaks late in the summer. And knowing now that one of the key patterns in the early season is certain types of food sources, and acorns are one of them. So it's interesting looking back now on some of those times and the different hunts that I had, how we were hunting some of those patterns. Didn't know it back then, but realize it now,
Yeah, it's amazing once you start to process a lot of information. I can attest to that exact thing you're saying, going way back, and then even sometimes it's like a week back or a season back where you read some of this stuff, or you attain some information through something like the Hunting Beast Forum or another podcast, and then you reference a specific event where you were in the woods and witnessed something happen, and you reflect on that now and you go, oh yeah, I get that. Now I understand why that happened. And sometimes it's really exciting because it can really shift your gear and make you realize something, something just clicks. It's been happening to me a lot lately. I just touched on you hosting the Hunting Beast podcast, and you just recently got the podcast all up on iTunes, and I think there's 22 or 23 episodes. Am I correct?
Yeah. Yep.
And since that happened, that's been what's taken up my time. I started at 1, and I think I'm at 7 now, and I'm going to listen to every single one, and I've had a lot of those aha moments as of lately just due to listening to that.
Yeah, and like I said before, that's been a really good experience for me because I get to ask questions of guys that are really knowledgeable and kind of honed their craft and have been doing this for a while. Mm-hmm. And that's always a good influence. I think guys that are getting into this or making a decision that they want to be more serious about it or go after a larger class whitetail or set some goals for themselves, I think keeping an open mind and being able to take suggestions or change or chances or try different techniques than they've tried in the past is what's going to allow them to be successful, which it wasn't a whole lot different than a lot of other things in life,
Yeah, you're right about that. Yeah, it's an evolutionary thing, right? You're either growing or you're dying, and you can sit stagnant and things won't change, or you can take it upon yourself to gain and apply knowledge and move ahead, and sometimes pretty rapidly if you find the right information.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I would say so. Since I was from my childhood hunting,
I wasn't. Well, real quick, what year approximately how old were you when you remember you started hunting?
I mean, first going out with my dad and just waterfowl hunting and rabbit hunting, where I was just tagging along, probably as young as 6 or 7, I think.
Okay.
You know, if where I was just kind of tagging along with them.
Sure.
When I actually started hunting, I think back then, I was 11, 12 years old when you could actually hunt. When I first started bow hunting and then rifle hunting for deer. So, I mean, I remember a lot of trips there's a big marsh, up to Horicon Marsh when I was a kid to goose hunt. And we would always duck hunt also on the Wisconsin River, and there's a series of sloughs and islands that are back through there. So we'd have a group of my dad's friends. There'd always be a group of guys that would come in for opening day of duck season, and we'd go out and hunt. So those are, a lot of my childhood memories. There was a lot of public hunting grounds that we'd go on where railroad tracks crossed, and it was a good spot to hunt rabbits. So my dad ran English pointers, and he had beagles, and we had a couple of different labs as a kid that we would hunt with. So that was kind of always part of the fabric of what my dad liked to do. He also really enjoyed trap shooting. So there was a small gun club that was in the area where I grew up. So on Tuesday nights, he would always go shoot trap league, and I would tag along with him and do that when I could. And I think really when I was growing up through middle school and high school, the group of guys that my dad bow hunted with, a lot of it was kind of that traditional style of hunting. You looked for a trail to set up on, or you were setting up between a food source and where you thought the deer were going to be coming. But I really don't recall anyone when I was a kid talking that much about bedding or where deer bed or why they bed where they do. And what's also interesting is the different times and phases during the year of how deer move and why. I mean, I remember guys talking about the rut and late rut, or the rut was happening late when gun season was just getting around, and the bucks were going to be moving on doe still by the time of opening day, gun season taking place. But the group that I hunted with and was around, the adults that I was around, I never heard them talk about or break it down in terms of a science or a pattern. Now, my dad, I know he had some chances at some shots at some really nice bucks, but like I said, our primary focus as kids was just harvesting deer. If we could get a number of doe and a good amount of meat in the freezer for the winter, then that was going to be part of what we ate for the entire year. So that was a big focus, and I enjoyed that because we'd bring the deer home, and it was a family affair. We'd clean the deer, skin it, chop up all the meat, package it, do everything ourselves, and I think I learned things the right way because of that. Where now I can, as I'm older, I can still enjoy those aspects of it, but I can also enjoy the challenge of kind of testing my wits against a more mature animal and his survival instincts. But yeah, so really throughout college, so through the 90s, I hunted kind of sparingly actually, because I competed collegiately in wrestling and I was busy with college. I actually had a couple guys that I was teammates with, Ben and Zach Schluter, who are pretty well known in the hunting community. They've taken a number of really nice whitetails. And those guys were a couple of guys that was interesting just to observe how they would hunt. Again, back then, not having a lot of time to focus on it, I didn't realize to the extent of how they were breaking down patterns, and they mainly hunt on small private woodlots, and the techniques and things that they were using on there wasn't aware to me at the time. I just knew that they had a wall full of giants, and I was like, how are you guys doing that, you know? And so it wasn't really till, you know, the late 90s, early 2000 where I decided, well, now I have more time and I want to do this more seriously and just get back into hunting. And I had a couple friends, one brother, Tom Scola, good friend of mine, and his brother Mike, who I hunted quite a bit with back up where I grew up for many years. And these guys did a lot of marsh and swamp hunting when they were kids. And again, same sort of thing. A lot of what they did focused on meat hunting. They did a lot of deer drives and a lot of hunting like that during gun season. So a lot of the things that we talked about were focused on bedding, deer transitioning from bedding to a food source, and how do we get in between them. And a lot of the hunting that we did during that time period was on a couple areas of public, but mainly a small private farm that was like 70 acres that we had access to. And what's interesting about that is guys that own their own land, I mean, there is the belief that, you know, it's my land, I'm going to set it up, I'm going to put food plots, I'm going to create the property, this perfect scenario for these deer to come and live, and then that big buck is going to show up and he's going to arrive. And I think back then I probably had some of those same thoughts that, well, that allure of that big whitetail or him showing up, you know, that's like a once in a lifetime thing that could happen. So, you know, you didn't really plan on setting up patterns to see that mature whitetail or find out where he beds or think about why the deer use the property the way they do. So about 6-7 years ago, when I first started trying to make a transition to shoot more mature animals, go ahead.
Just to cut you off real quick. So you started to make this transition before you and Dan had any type of working relationship together, before you guys had met. This was a thought process that you were involved with before you were involved with him, correct?
Yeah, I think the basic thought process was, you know, we were hunting we had climbers, right, that we would use if we'd go off in a public area. But mainly this farm that we hunted on had fixed ladder stands that we had used throughout, I mean, my whole childhood. You know, they were on the main travel corridors of the property, and this property was surrounded by other farms. So not too untypical of what other people did. I mean, as the wind changed, you would change your positions in these stands. And what we began to observe is that these deer were patterning us. I mean, I specifically remember my friend saying at one point, he goes, yeah, this set of doe came out of the corner of the field and they all looked up right at the ladder stand where I was sitting, you know. Right. And so I would say the first transition thing that I made, and I always recommend this to guys, is I decided I needed to get mobile. And the mobile part of it was I needed to not sit in the same place every single time I had hunted. Now, again, because everyone's excited about getting out and getting hunting and getting time on stand, I still hunted a lot. I hunted that property way more than I ever should have in those early years. And that was in, you know, you're talking 98, 99, 2000, where before CWD really hit that area and the Ernebuck stuff came through Wisconsin, there was kind of a peak there where you had the deer herd was at kind of a max population, and there was a lot of big whitetails running around. So the thing that I think about now when I look back, those first couple years that we started hunting that property again, after it sort of sat dormant for many years because no one bow hunted it. it would get gun hunted every year, but bow hunting was very minimal. Through the time that I wasn't hunting it, we saw a lot of mature bucks. We didn't shoot any, but we saw a lot during our sits during bow season. As we pressured that land more and more throughout that time period, we started to see less and less mature bucks. And I think I correlate that to just presence on the property. So, one thing for people to consider when they have their own private piece of land, you still need to mix it up. You still need to get out and find areas on public or find other private land that you can gain access to through, volunteering work for a farmer or something, but have options. Have options for different winds, for different setups, and plan for it. Because a lot of people think that their little private piece of property, well, it's only me hunting on it. There's not going to be that much pressure. But if you hunt it every single day and bounce around that whole thing on every single type of wind, well, it's not going to take too long for you to get, your scent and your presence all over that property. And so that was the first kind of thing that I transitioned into is getting mobile. And at first was just I had a lone wolf climber, hand climber, and I began to really think about, okay, if I sat one sit on a setup, saw deer travel or movement in a certain position, my next sit based on wind, I was going to position myself where I would be in the closest proximity to that deer travel. And I started moving around in that manner. And there was a run there. I mean, every year I'd shoot something, whether it be a doe or a buck. But it wasn't really till 2012, and this is where things sort of clicked as to how that property worked and why. And if if I look back, sort of coincides when I started reading up on the information that was on the beast. I had met Dan around that time, and I started thinking more closely about how my setups were and why. And ironically enough, I ended up shooting a large 9-pointer off that property, which was the biggest buck I had ever taken with my bow off that property that year. And what I learned about that hunt is that property had a primary ridge line, because it's hill country there, that ran through the entire property. And I never noticed this or never looked at it, I guess, when I was a kid, but that primary ridge line that ran through the property, during different phases of the year, it held bedding off all those leeward points, right? Now, there was a specific section on that property that was thick with buckthorn and prickly ash, and that section actually was the one place where there was doe bedding. And just adjacent to it, like down the ridge, there was a spot when the foliage was thicker earlier in the year that would hold bucks. Now, I never witnessed a buck get up out of a bed there. This was just on observations when I'd sat there later, during the rut, and I'd seen smaller bucks go in and bed down and get up out of there. I had bumped bigger bucks out of that bed walking into the property before. But what was interesting to me about that leeward side of that ridge is that depending on how the foliage was, if you were sitting in proximity to that bed, you could see our access to the property. Mm-hmm. Literally from eyesight. So if you're thinking about, how a buck beds now, when I think about it differently, that buck had a couple down trees, so kind of a nasty tangle of logs and down trees. There were wild raspberry that was around that ridge top, and it was a point. And he could sit on that point that was in between two ravines, and he, typical west wind that would come through, he'd have that to his back. And from visibility in hill country, he could see it all the way across the property, and he can see anything that was accessing in that field. Now, I don't tell you how many times throughout the years, we walked right up the road and walked right into the field and probably bumped deer off that ridge, not even knowing it. Um, so why that 2012 years was important, because the time that I got that buck, I actually witnessed that buck stage and corral a doe on top of that ridge on that leeward side. And in doing that, I didn't know there was a doe up there at the time bedded, but I saw the buck enter up onto the ridge. He was up there grunting, making a lot of activity, and I hadn't even made it all the way up my tree yet. I actually still had my bow laying on the ground and just had my string in my hand because I was using my climber to climb up the tree. And I look, and this thing made its way onto the ridge, and it's grunting. Well, then I look off to my left, and another buck is accessing off the adjacent farm field on the logging road. And this buck charged down off the ridge and did a snort wheeze and ran that buck right off back into the field. Well, then at that time, he gave me a little bit of enough time where I could climb a couple more hops up the tree, and I actually pulled my bow up at that point. But now I'm still facing the tree, looking at the ridge, and that buck got back up onto the ridge, and he bumped that doe. And I watched him dogtail that doe through that thick brush, and it just so happened that she ended up coming out. She made her way actually to the base of the tree that I was sitting in. She looked up but didn't spook and turned and walked the opposite direction of me, and he followed her down the trail, and to his demise, it was like a 15-yard broadside shot, and I hit him. He ran up the ridge. But the biggest thing I gained for that, I was like, that spot, that ridge, was a place that during that pre-rut and that rut time of the year, that they were going to use that bedding area because these bucks could go up there and they could smell both sides of the ridge points. There was a ridge, a ravine, and another ridge on the other side. So any deer, any hot doe that was accessing from the field or was coming on that other lower ridge point, they could smell through that leeward wind, and they just cruise that leeward side, looking for those doe. And I'd actually observed bucks doing that on the property before, but never put the pieces together like that. So for actually the next 4 seasons, until the property ended up being sold and switched owners, we hunted it that way. We actually only did about 1 hunt on it in the early season, and only in the front half of the property, which there's a set of oak trees, and we kind of keyed in on those. And then we stayed out of there, because aside from those 2 spots, there wasn't a lot of bedding on that property. It was fairly open. The neighboring properties held most of the bedding. And what we found is that we could slide in on that leeward side depending on the wind. And 2 years in a row, I mean, I was already tagged out, but I brought my buddy up there to hunt. And 2 years in a row, I put him on 3 different really nice bucks. He probably won't like me mentioning this, but he's normally a crack shot. He shot over the back of all 3 of them. But the pattern still played out. Those bucks came up out of bedding. The doe would typically stage and corral in that doe bedding area right on top of that ridge, and those bucks would cruise in from the neighboring properties and check that bedding area, and then cruise the leeward side of that entire ridge that ran the full length of the property, scent checking any of those beds that were along the way. So that was kind of cool. That go ahead.
Yeah, you're saying that was what year was that again around?
That was between 2012 and 2016. So the property sold last year. Yeah.
Okay. Were you using digital scouting tools at that time and locating these type of areas, or was this something that you were doing just when you were in the woods starting to identify that?
I mean, we had mapped out the entire property on Google Maps a number of times before, right? And looked at how the lay of the land was, but it wasn't until I started reading about the beast and getting info from Dan about how to look at these hill country maps and these different points that I started looking at it with a topo map. And, interestingly enough, when I first showed Dan a map of that property, he's like, well, I would expect bedding here, and I would expect the bucks to run in this location right here. And as you can imagine, ironically, that's that one hot spot where, it took me, an entire lifetime to figure it out on foot. But again, it's experience, right? So I think on that property, a couple key combinations. Understanding the lay of the land and how those deer traveled on it, right? Figuring out that leeward side of that ridge that ran the full length of the property connected all the key bedding points, and there was just 2 small key bedding points that were on that property. Knowing that by looking on a topo, you could see those points on a topo map. I mean, they were apparent, right? Mm-hmm. Knowing that, during early season when the foliage was thick, there was going to be deer bedded there, but it was very difficult to get in close to them because our only access point was from down below. So you got to play the whole thermal and sight thing when you're trying to get on them, without actually having to loop all the way up and around the deer, which was a difficult thing to do because the property to our south we didn't have access to, so it was hard to do that. So we only really had one access point to the property. So I think if I would have known that in the earlier years, I would have hunted that property very differently. And I would have realized that it probably was a really good property for just a couple early season sits based on food sources. Mm-hmm. And then really good for that pre-rut phase, because most of the primary bedding was on all the neighboring properties. But this property, what was unique is that ridge line and how if you looked at the topography of that whole bluff that it sat on, that ridge line was kind of that 2/3 elevation that ran around that entire bluff that it was on.
Right.
So it was a main travel corridor that they were using.
So if you're going off topography and topo maps, the deer favor elevation changes where they can get vantage points and where they can also use thermals and wind currents to their advantage. And then on flatter areas, they're using mostly structure changes, right? Like lines in like where a hardwood essentially might meet a swamp or transitional areas, you call them, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think anything could be looked at as a transition. You can have a cornfield that's up against a fence row of a thicket, and that's a transition. Deer can bed on there. I still do think that the elevation, even though it might not be true hill country, in farmland, your elevation might just be a hump. Or in big woods, you might just have a small hump or an elevation in the woods that these deer are bedding on to give them that little bit of elevation where they have that wind to their back. But most of those hill country sets, what's interesting is you'll find those trees that are on the leeward side in that kind of military crest, as Dan describes it, or that 2/3 elevation, and you'll see where they're bedding, with that tree to their back. So they have that vantage point to look downhill, or they have some thick cover to their back. I think that's what was unique about those 2 spots on the property, is that they had thick up above. If you've got a wide open space up above on that hilltop, it's not going to provide a whole lot of cover from behind for them to feel safe. So
The military crest, the 2/3 elevation, that's something that I've paid a lot of attention to this year when I did a lot of my spring scouting, and there it is without question. I mean, that's where you're going to find the density of deer movement in elevation changes and ridges and things like that. And then I watched something on one of the Hunting Beast scouting videos, and Dan was explaining and calling it essentially the wind tunnel. And the wind tunnel, for the most part, also resides at that military crest. And can you kind of explain to me in detail and to the listeners what that exactly is, what's happening there?
Yeah, I mean, it's much easier to explain with a diagram, but I think what you got to picture a deer, so you have the crest of your hill. So picture a deer that's sitting on the leeward side at that 2/3 elevation, so just off from the top of that hill, right? So the wind's going to be blowing up over the backside of that hill, okay? So as the wind blows up over the backside of the hill, it has a tendency to swirl inward, so swirl back into the hillside, right? And that swirling inward is what creates that tunnel. And now if you think about how thermals work, as the side of that hill heats up, those thermals are going to rise up the hill. So if you're an animal like a mature whitetail that's using your nose more than you're using your eyesight, sitting at that 2/3 elevation with the wind blowing off your back, blowing to your back up over that hill, you're going to be able to smell any predator that's coming from behind, right, where you can't see, and you'll have thick to your back so they can't see you. That wind's going to come up over and it's going to swirl around, creating that tunnel. And then any thermals that are rising up from down below are going to trigger you of any predators coming from down below. And then actually, in a lot of those traditional hill country settings, if you've got very high peaks or hills, like the property was that I was hunting, there's this long vantage point that you could see from as well. So, when the foliage would start to drop a little, those deer are able to see, like I said, across the property. They're seeing, 200 yards out into a field. They're going to see your movement as you're coming in.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know if that makes sense.
It does, and Dan has even said it too. There's a visual thing that sometimes will happen if you're paying close attention and you catch the right scenario and the wind is strong enough in the fall when the leaves are dry and you have good gusts of wind, you may actually be able to physically witness these wind tunnels carrying leaves in a pattern at that, at that military crest and physically see this happen.
Yeah, I mean, we've all seen when in our yard when we have the winds blowing and you'll see like a water spout happen. We used to call them as kids, but it's basically the wind whips into sort of a mini tornado, and those are vertical, right? But it picks up the leaves and it's spinning it like that. Mm-hmm. So, just think of that happening on a horizontal plane, but it's in that too coming over the hill. And that wind is wrapping over at a rapid pace, and it's swirling inward. So, but it is, it's kind of a concept. You think of it and you're like, well, it sounds kind of crazy, but I think it's hard sometimes for us as humans to think of things that way because we don't use our nose like that, right? We're using 100%. Our eyesight more than we are our nose. So I think it's more about when you're looking at it, if you were a predator, how are you going to try to get access to that deer? And if you're a deer and your main purpose out there is, your primary needs, your food, your shelter, your survival, then you're going to think differently about how you orient yourself in your environment. And I've been on a couple scouting trips with Dan in some hill country areas, some public hill country areas, where, he's identified beds, and you can see these beds on these points where they'll actually move from one side of the point to the other side of the point. There'll be a bed when the wind shifts, that deer will get up and make a micro shift to adjust for that wind. So I think
Thermals.
it's just a different, it's a different way of thinking about it. And a lot of it is the hill country stuff, because of that, I think can be much more difficult to get onto some of those mature deer than what we see in swamps sometimes, because of that X factor of the thermals and the elevation and trying to get access to them.
But now outside of hill country, I mean, thermals in general, they occur everywhere, typically day to day, maybe not as extreme as in hill country. But when you're hunting bedding, I mean, is it always something that's on your mind no matter where you're at? Is there areas that you don't have to take it into account, or is it something that you're always thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I might as well tell this part of it too, because it's been the hot topic on a couple of the forums, just about scent control and what to do. I mean, I was no different than anyone else when I started out kind of getting back into this. I was drinking the Kool-Aid and wearing scent lock and spraying myself down before I went out to hunt, and taking showers and cleaning off and making sure all my gear was clean. And I think, I'm not saying that's necessarily bad if it gives you confidence, but I think now I don't do any of that. I think more about the wind, and I think more about thermals and where I'm setting up versus trying to clean myself off to outsmart a deer's nose, Plus, I think, all the time and energy I spent cleaning and making sure all my clothes were clean and everything was pristine before I went out to hunt was probably more time I could have spent in the woods hunting versus doing that. But I think for a lot of guys, they believe in it and it gives them confidence. And I'm not, if that's your thing, that's your thing. For me, I don't do it anymore. I think much more about access routes, and when I'm accessing, how the wind is affecting my access. So, for example, recent hunt that we had this week, where we had this southeast wind, I wanted to access on the downwind side of this island, so I could set up on it. Reason being, I didn't want my scent, blowing over the island or coming from down below where I knew it could potentially blow into some of the bedding that was to my south, right? So I made a bigger loop around to access in on the downwind side of the island when I came into it. Mm-hmm. And then typically I always carry milkweed with me, because what I've seen with the wind, you could have a predominant wind direction that's, let's say, coming out of the northwest or southeast, but wind travels a lot like water does around rocks in a river or any sort of obstruction, right? The predominant current, when it's trickling along, just doesn't flow straight over that rock. It flows around it. And if you watch wind and thermal patterns when you're in the woods, or let's say you just break out of the woods and you get onto a transition and then go onto an island, that wind will tunnel in to that transition and shoot the gap, right? Mm-hmm. So, or it'll weave its way through the topography of the trees that you're sitting in. One of the hunts I had a couple years ago, I had this happen to me where Dan had seen some sign on this island open up. There was a rub and a scrape that opened up on this island. So he didn't have time to sit it. We knew it required a sit. We had a good wind for it, which was a northwest wind. So when I entered the island, I actually entered the southern tip of the island. But when I came up onto the island, I got a little too much on to the west side of the island. So this island had a small crest on it, if you can imagine, right? I kind of crossed over the crest of that island onto the west side. And the reason why that was important, I mean, the main current of the wind was still blowing my scent west, which was fine. That wasn't a problem, right? But there was an opening that was in the middle of the island that was, 30 yards in front of me, which, knowing now how it played out, that was actually a bowl that my scent was trapping in and wrapping around in. So by sitting on that western side of the island with a west wind, it was just enough where my wind was blowing and catching in that opening of that bowl and swirling in there. And how it ended up playing out, there was a large mature buck that ran in from the northern tip of the island, and he entered into that open bowl, that opening in that island, and he froze. And he stuck his nose up in the air, and he scanned that whole island. He knew that something wasn't right. Now, mind you, I had not walked anywhere near the access trail that he came in on. I had not been over to that side of the island at all. And just 10 minutes earlier, a doe ran straight down that island and came right underneath my tree stand and checked a scrape that was there. And another satellite buck that was off to the west got up out of a bed and chased that doe in the transition just past me. And that triggered him, which was a more mature buck, to get up and charge the island. But he knew I was there. And literally the change in position, if I would have been 15 yards over to my east with that west wind, it would have carried my scent outside of that open bowl, because I would have been on the downwind side of that island. And, again, it's no guarantee, but that buck probably wouldn't have smelled me, and he would have walked the needed extra 10 yards to get into my shooting lane.
How critical is milkweed to identifying the stuff? I had heard Dan talk about it a couple different times, and I kind of blew it off. I thought, that's kind of quirky. You can just use the powder. You don't really have to go out pulling weeds and pulling them apart and dropping them, until I started doing it. And then I don't know if it was something Dan said in particular that made me a little more interested in it, but I've been playing around with it, and it's like such an amazing tool. It will change the way you look at and think about everything. And like you were talking about earlier, you mentioned we can't think like deer because we can't smell like deer, so it's hard for us to understand. But if you drop a couple pieces of milkweed and watch what the wind does to it, it is literally amazing. Just depending on, like you said, if you shift 15 feet or sometimes even less, 5 feet, of how much of a different pattern that can travel, and it starts to open up your eyes to, boy, where is this going, and how is this changing throughout the day with the temperatures changing and a little bit of shifts in the wind and things of that nature. It's I don't know, it's really been a game changer for me.
Yeah, I think it's until you actually just grab some and sit in a tree stand and start playing around with it, because it's fun to do, and see it for your own eyes, I think people are a little bit skeptical about why you want to do it. I mean, I've talked to a number of people, because the properties that we go hunt, there's milkweed that grows all over around here. So I usually, I got a whole pile of milkweed pods that are sitting on my workbench in my garage just drying out. So I'll grab some and I'll give it to a guy and say, here, try this when you're up there. And they're like, oh, I got my little powder bottle or I have a string. And I think, those are going to show you general wind direction, right? But they're not necessarily going to show you how that wind or thermal is traveling through the piece of property that you're sitting on.
Right. It only shows you an extremely small percentage, a very short-term observation of what that wind does, a very small fraction.
Right. And typically during, that everyone knows kind of when that prime time hits, when it's just getting towards dusk, and a lot of times that wind will calm down, the woods will calm down. you don't have a heavy, steady wind current at that point. It might be a trickle of a wind current, and then it's what the thermals are doing.
Right.
And you can, if you've got a lot of water and swamp that's next to you, or you've got a body of water that's next to you, and it's been a hot day, and that body of water is heated up, and there's thermals rising off of that, and you're sitting in close proximity to it, and the ground that you're on, because the sun is no longer hitting it, is cooling off. Those thermals and that warm water, I mean, that's going to pull your scent towards it, and you can see that happen. I mean, I've been sitting on a transition swamp before between the hardwoods and popples and swamp grass, and had wind in my face, and then right during prime time, when everything calms down and that wind dies down, all of a sudden it switches, and every milkweed I drop, instead of going off my back shoulder, starts pulling towards the swamp. And then, in those situations, it's kind of like, well, it is what it is. And, maybe that buck smells you, maybe he doesn't. But those are kind of the types of shifts and the things that I think the guys that are a little bit more advanced or plan their things out are thinking about, how is that wind going to shift? How is it going to impact where that deer comes in off of his access trail, and why?
Right. How do you dry those? Do you just pull them? I mean, is there a certain amount of time that it takes, or do you have any process? Is it just pull them and let them sit for a couple weeks, or do you cut the ends of the pods open so that air can actually go inside there?
Yeah, I had more success. Like, I'll just take them and pull them, and I've just left them before, but this year I just took a razor knife and cut the pods down the middle, and they seem to dry out a lot quicker. There's a lot of humidity and moisture in those things, so, if you do have some nearby, that if they're grown in your yard, or if you've got them, there's actually a park that's nearby the house here that they grow all along the walking trail. So, really out in the wild, it's been so dry here the last couple of weeks that it gets to a certain point in the fall where they all start drying out, and you can just start picking dry pods right off the plant that are in perfect condition for you. But, there's still quite a few pods even this last weekend.
For anybody that would be hearing about this for the first time or is uncertain what milkweed is, you can just go on Google and images and find milkweed, and then they grow these pods with essentially it's almost like a fibrous material inside, right? And each one has a seed attached to it. Now, do you, when you use these, I've been having the best luck getting them to float the best, where I'll pull the individual strands out and I'll pull the little seed off, and then I kind of fluff it up a little bit and I'll let it go. Is that how you do it, or do you have a different method?
No, I pull the seeds off. I actually take it. I just have in my vest, I have a pocket that I just jam pods in. After a while, those things throughout the season, that whole pocket full of milkweed pod just kind of dries out, becomes just a mass of effectively, it looks like tufts of cotton, and I just reach my hand in there and grab out a tuft and kind of twist it with my finger, and they separate and they just float out. It's very similar to cottonwood. Like, our neighbor's got a cottonwood tree that's behind our house, and when that thing drops cotton, I actually took video of it this year because there was a fairly strong wind, but the cotton was floating in every direction imaginable in the yard. Some was channeling between the two houses because that's where the wind was funneling. There was a wind tunnel draft that was, cottonwood would blow up high, but then it would suck down low and travel in the opposite direction back against the grain of the wind. So, I think it's a great tool just to see how the wind is acting in its natural environment. Maybe it says northwest, maybe it says southeast, but throw some pods out there and see where they go, you know. And if you do it throughout your whole sit, you can really start to see how it changes as you're up in the tree stand.
Yeah, and I know for me it's been a big thing too. You know, I used to just go on the weather app and I'd say, oh, southeast wind, I'll go sit here, right? And then, you know, if there's any kind of topography involved or a rising or falling temperature, depending on where I'm going when I got there, the wind might be doing something completely different. And I've been able to, you know, I started doing it with powder and that helped a little bit, but now the milkweed is such a valuable tool. And you can start to log in your head, like, okay, if I do have a southeast wind and I go here, I know the wind, or I can assume the wind is doing this based on my evaluation the last time I was in here and did this, and you can kind of start cataloging these in your head.
Yeah, and I always I keep them easy to access so I can drop them as I'm going in, so you can check the wind as you're walking in to make sure it's not doing anything squirrely. But the reality of it is it's a lot of variables. The wind travels differently through different topographies. It's going to go into open spaces. It's going to flow into those open spaces. Thermals are going to do the same thing. If you've got a dense, thick patch of cover, it's going to roll around that. The predominant wind currents that are up high in the tree are going to be different than what's down low. You know, depending on the height that you're sitting in the tree stand is going to affect how that wind is and thermals are going to flow from you. So, you know, I think to me it's more fun playing around with that and figuring that out than trying to conceal my entire body in a vacuum suit of.
I kind of. I kind of agree, and it's a lot more cost efficient too, right? Like we're all working guys collecting a paycheck. Milkweed's free. The other stuff can add up to quite an investment. Would you be? Is it the number one thing to know and understand when you're starting to approach hunting in this manner is understanding the wind and thermals?
Yeah, I think if I, again, go back to that learning curve and that transition, so the first thing I talked about was just getting mobile, right? And then it was understanding, well, okay, how are deer bedding on a property and why, and how are they using that bedding based on the time of the year and how they move through that property. And then you start pulling it together, well, okay, how does bedding determine proximity to food sources? But then once you start physically finding some beds, or maybe you're doing cyber scouting and you're, you know, postulating that there'll be a bed at this point because it looks like, you know, a buck would bed there based on what the topography looks like, then I think, I think you're thinking about the wind. Again, there was a few years there where I don't say laugh, but it's a kind of a learning curve where I was hunting a lot of morning hunts because I wanted to be out in the woods and I wanted to hunt. And I would walk into these areas because I just felt it was a good area to see a deer on a heavy trail in the morning, right? Mm-hmm. But I wasn't thinking about my wind specifically when I walked into those areas. And when I think back, I spooked a lot of deer in the morning walking into those areas. And I didn't, you know, there were mornings where I sat and I didn't see a lot of deer. But I wasn't consciously thinking of, well, how am I accessing this area that I'm hunting, and where is my wind blowing when I access it? Or how am I accessing it and crossing trails where I expect deer to be coming from? You know, quite often I would walk in, maybe walk 75, 100 yards in one direction, and then turn around and come back and set up behind that spot that I had already walked in. I think that has an impact on getting a mature deer. If you've already crossed a trail and he comes in on it, you know, he has the potential to smell you. So
right.
That's the type of thing I think about more now I always look at the wind before I go out, and that determines where I'm going to go sit. If I really want to hunt my favorite spot, but the wind isn't right, then I don't hunt it. I go hunt somewhere else. And I think a lot of the guys that I've interviewed on the podcast, it seems like this reigning theme that these guys had, not just one, not just two, not just three, but dozens of spots and options that they could go sit based on wind, time of year, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and the wind is a two-part thing when you're saying about going where you're going to. It's a two-part thing, right? One is being able to use the wind to your advantage to carry your scent away from the deer, and two, it will dictate to some point where deer bed, correct? So in two ways, it's dictating where you're going, right?
Right. Because deer are going to bed. I mean, and I think when you observe the deer getting out of the bedding after you've kind of put some of these plans together. Now, if you've been able to go out in the early spring and identify these beds outside of the season and you confirm that there's beds there, then the next step is throwing a stand at it, right? So let's say I'm hunting this swamp and I believe that there's bedding, to my east, and it's right out in front of me in that swamp. Well, obviously I prefer to have a just off wind coming from the east, right? Or some sort of straight north or south wind, or northeast or southeast. So my theory behind that is that those deer are going to be bedded in that bedding with the wind to their back, looking out of that swamp onto that island or onto that high ground, right? Mm-hmm. And I think the next step for a guy when he's learning this stuff is to start throwing stands at it and start hunting some of these sets to get observations and hopefully kills. But, at the minimum to get observations and see how deer move. And then when they see deer get up or move out of these bedding areas, think about, well, why was that deer bedded there? Or if on your way in you're accessing and you bump a deer, which will happen, take note of the wind at the spot that you're at. And, maybe if you're going to walk past that spot anyways and you blew out the bed, go in there and just look at, well, why was that buck bedded there? Look at the bed, examine it, sit down in it, and try to understand why that buck was bedded in that spot. Based on wind, based on food source, based on time of year, based on cover that he had around him. Think about it. And you can start putting the pieces together.
You were talking about seasonal change. Does the bedding change quite a bit from, like, let's say the beginning of October, which, basically everybody throughout the country, I believe, around October 1st is opening, up until, into obviously the month of November, which is the rut month, we'll say, and then tailing off into December for deer season. How much does the bedding change throughout the season, and how much does your approach change to hunting the bedding throughout the season?
I mean, based on my observations, you're going to have primary bedding spots that the alpha deer are always going to use throughout the year. Now, I think pressure and how the deer herd, the doe herd moves around may change where and how those bucks bed. But what I've seen in swamp scenarios, well, maybe I just look back at the hill country that I've hunted. That bedding would definitely change as it increased into fall because the cover would dissipate. So you'd have really dense cover on those ridges when the greenery was really heavy, right?
Mm-hmm.
But once that stuff started to drop and fall off, then it became more wide open. Those beds became less favorable because it was more wide open for those deer. And it's my, theory that those bucks vacated those beds and came back and used them, in the pre-rut and the rut. Now, what I've seen and observed in a lot of these swamps and marshes that I've hunted is that those transition points between the high ground and the marsh or the swamp, earlier in the season, it seems like those deer there'll be a lot more of those satellite or tertiary deer that'll be bedded up in those transitions close to the high ground. So you're going to bump deer. You're going to bump doe that are bedded up on the high ground on the island, or you may bump smaller bucks that are bedded up closer to the island. But anything that's been around for 4 years, 3 years, and that 3 to 6 year age class buck, I think is still going to be bedded in those primary bedding areas, back in the thicker stuff, away from the islands. Now, I think if they get pressured and they get bumped out of those areas, either from hunters, people going in there or whatever, then they're going to move. They're going to move to other bedding areas where they feel safe, and that can change their bedding habits. Mm-hmm. I also think, and we've observed this, that there's certain beds that they use as rut beds, right? And Dan and I have observed this on properties that we hunt, that these bucks will bed in specific beds during rut because they're in close proximity to doe bedding. So based on certain winds, they can smell if there's a hot doe on the property or in that doe bedding area, and they'll actually travel the property bouncing from doe bedding area to doe bedding area to check those areas. But I've seen, that story I told her, that was that one satellite bed that was just off the west side of that island I was sitting on. I mean, that I would look at that bed as more as a rut bed, although I have bumped a buck out of there or a deer out of there in early season. But, that buck was bedded there waiting for something to come up onto that island. And that doe that did come up on the island was a hot doe. And that other buck that was bedded off the point, that doe came from his direction. But, he waited to come up on the island until she went up and checked that scrape. And again, based on how the wind was blowing, that west wind was blowing across that island, that scent stream would have been going right to where that bed was, which we verified there was a bed there, in the spring. It would have been blown right to where that big buck was bedded. And he got up and charged the island right after she left the island. So after seeing stuff like that, I don't think it's coincidence. I think those bucks will change beds to monitor doe movement during the rut. But they will, the biggest bucks are going to compete for the most secure bedding, and they're going to hold that stuff down.
What time frame are you typically talking about, like Halloween through the month of November, or more specifically a couple weeks in November when you're referencing the rut bedding?
I've observed that stuff, that, last week of October, first week of November, that whole time I've seen that sort of activity pick up. Yeah. Okay. But any time that you've got a hot doe in the area, the buck I shot last year, I hunted that same area 3 sits in the early season. Mm-hmm. And that during those 3 sits, I didn't see any antlers during those sits, but I did have an encounter with a doe and her fawns that got up out of bedding in the swamp grass. And that was one of those scenarios where the thermals shifted. They winded me when she got up because my thermals were like cruising right down where they were walking in. They turned around and walked right back to bedding. But what was interesting about that, the sit that I had before I shot the buck, there was a spot out in those cattails where I could hear like a tending grunt going on the entire night. Now, nothing ever came out of there. But that area, again, I would theorize that a buck moved into that area because there was a small doe bedding area and there was a hot doe in that area and he was tending her there. Mm-hmm. But that buck, I pretty much can guarantee, wasn't bedded in that same spot in the early season. But he was bedded in that area with that doe that night and tending her. And the way that kind of all those islands merged together, there were multiple bucks that night, smaller ones, that were running into that same area in the cattails, and he was chasing them out, tending his doe, chasing him out, tending his doe, chasing him out. Well, finally the doe popped out, and it was, your typical pinch point between two islands, funnel, and she ran right down the middle of that pinch point, and he was following, and I was set up right on the edge of that transition, so it was his demise. But
there's something
I think that's a
interesting
scenario too.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think in that scenario, that buck was there because of that doe and the proximity to the other activity.
Yeah, what I was
going to think he was betting out there.
What I was going to say in reference to that is something that I had read about doe activity on, if you're hunting a property and you're monitoring it, spending some time on there, just like buck activity, you can kind of start to identify patterns that does have. And I had read this, that, on a piece of property, there will be multiple doe families that will occupy it. And they are, one will be the most dominant doe family, and the others will be subordinates to that. And just like all deer, they compete for resources and nutrition and food, and the dominant doe group in the area will be the healthiest doe group in the area. And if this holds true, it's something that I want to pay attention to this season. It'd be a hard thing to do, but it's at least something that I'm thinking about, is that most dominant doe group, the healthiest doe group, will be the first ones to come into estrus, and potentially the bucks will identify that, and maybe possibly if you're locating this buck bedding, potentially the earliest doe groups, if you can identify where they are bedding, maybe the mature bucks can identify that as well. I don't know. It's maybe something that I'm going to pay attention to this season. Is that anything you've ever heard about?
I mean, I haven't heard about that specifically, but it makes sense. I mean, animals, really the natural law of things. I mean, animals are going to have, with a natural state of survival of the fittest, right? So, that's why you see bucks compete for food sources. That's why bucks compete for does. That's why animals, typically you'll see males competing for females, right? And in animals, in a lot of different scenarios. Where the males in bird species typically can be more colorful, and there's a lot of bird species that have specific calls or dances or displays that they go through in order to attract females. I mean, turkeys do that, right, as well. Reason being is, they're trying to pass on the strongest, fittest set of genes. So I think I've heard someone else talk about that the dominant genes, to grow larger whitetails, it has a lot to do with the genetics of the doe, just as much as it has to do with the genetics of the buck. And I'm sure there is a lot of truth to that because it's you're getting genetics from both when they breed. So that good gene pool, that healthy gene pool is what's going to produce the strongest animal that's going to survive the longest in the environment. And animals know. Go ahead.
I had read the same thing, that potentially even the doe's genes are a small percentage more important, which, would
Right.
not be what I would have thought before I had ever heard of that, but that was by a couple of biologists that I always struggle to remember the name of the school. I believe it's either Mississippi State or Missouri State. One of those schools have a big whitetail deer department, and the two biologists that they actually started recently, a couple years ago, or a couple months back, doing a podcast, and I had listened to that, and they had talked about that genetic structure and how important the doe health and genes are to the offspring of the buck, and what the potential can be versus the male's genes. It was a pretty interesting thing to listen to.
Yeah, and it all makes sense. I mean, the standard growth and development of an animal as it's growing in the womb. I mean, the doe is the one that's carrying the fawn, right?
Right.
If she has superior genetics, she has superior food source, she has superior nutrition, that's that fawn's going to be born healthy. It's going to have a jump start. It's going to be bigger and stronger. It has a better sense of instinct, protection instincts. We know that animals pass on those instincts or those patterns or those traits for survival. You can argue, do they talk to each other or how they learn it, but there's definitely studies out there that show that animals learn travel patterns, and they pass things down from generations. And typically, I think one of the studies that I saw that was done on caribou and how caribou migrate, but it's the does that have that internal compass of, there's a couple key does that are in the herds that help with migrations. So yeah, I would believe that our male genes probably just aren't that important.
It was just a real eye-opener to me, thinking, because it seems that the deer in an area arguably know each other on somewhat of a personal basis. They all have their smell and sign, and they kind of all know where they are, and these doe groups can, depending on how good their health is, that can dictate them coming into estrus earlier or later, and sometimes those dates can be separated by weeks. And I would have never thought that. I know it always hovers around the beginning to the middle of November. Obviously, is the peak when most of it happens, but your healthier doe will typically be the first groups to come into estrus, where your more subordinate, less healthier doe groups will be the ones till later, and the bucks will know these groups, and they will know them by their social status, and they will target those does. They potentially know that the matriarch doe is going to be the first one. The healthiest doe herd is going to be the first one, and potentially that's where you might find that first buck occupying a bed close to that doe group, if you could go so far as to identify that.
Yeah, which might be a challenging feat, but
maybe
still good to think about.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, it's a factor. I think.
As if hunting bedding isn't complicated enough, throw that in there.
Right. Right. I think
Um,
another comment to make about the bedding, and go ahead.
no,
Another comment to make about the bedding is that, and Dan and I have observed this year actually, is when you get it seems if you get more mature animals that are competing for that bedding in an area, you're going to see more sign early. Thing happen with this where if there's only maybe a small percentage of mature animals, you're not seeing a lot of sign early. You're not seeing scrapes, you're not seeing rubs, you're not seeing these things. When based on trail cam pics that we've had from the year before, where there are a bunch of 2-year-olds or 2.5-year-olds, so we're theorizing that there's going to be more 3-year-olds and some 4-year-olds that got through. Well, now we're seeing a lot more rubs and scrapes and sign of active competition earlier in the year in close proximity to bedding. So these bucks are competing and they're marking their place adjacent to these bedding areas, and I think that too is where some of the mature animals, if they don't have much competition, they might not make much sign around,
sure.
if they're not having to compete. So that's one thing for guys to factor in. If they're not seeing a whole lot of sign, it doesn't necessarily mean there's not a mature buck in the area. It just means there might not be a number of them competing,
Yeah, that's a great thing to
So,
point out because that can really throw you through a loop. I've had just even this last weekend, and I'm glad you said that because it reiterates it to me. Because I was in an area this weekend that I thought for sure, I was going to find a lot of good buck bedding. And I did find, I went right to where I thought it was going to be, and I found beds. But there was a very, very small amount of, rubs and any kind of solid, sign. And I wonder if that's potentially why, is because this bedding is so good that there is, 1 or 2 dominant animals in the area that's held up in there, and they're not trying to compete.
Yeah, I mean it's probably more significant. It might be that there's not bucks there, or it's low density.
Right.
Versus high density, high competition for that area.
Right.
So, but you're not going to know. The big trick of that whole thing is a lot of times you're not going to know that unless you get cameras out or you throw a stand at it to figure it out. I
Right.
think is what you need to do. I think going back to the transition into this style of hunting for guys that are starting out, I know we touched on obsessing over the wind or checking it and working on that, becoming more mobile. I think another big thing too is as hunters, a lot of times we grow up and we get taught certain patterns or ways that we hunt or things that we do. I think you got to be able to get outside your comfort zone and do and try things that you weren't willing to do before. I mean, people are going to look at you a little crazy when you throw on, your stand and grab your bow, and you probably have like 30 pounds of gear on your back, and you're taking your bow and you're walking 2 miles back into a spot. And, in the early season, what guys should realize when you're first setting up in a scenario where you're putting up sticks in a hang-on, you're going to have times where your hunt is basically you sweating your butt off walking back. You get set up, you dropped one of your sticks when you were up in your stand, you tried hanging your stand and it was crooked, so you're sitting crooked on a tree for 2 hours and your back is aching and mosquitoes were attacking you, you got full of poison ivy, and you came out of there and you asked yourself, why am I doing this? That's part of it. But for me, part of that was I enjoy the challenge physically that some hunting this style brings to the table to some extent. I know that I won't be able to do it forever. But it's funny. One of the first hunts, I think it was the first hunt I did with Dan. I've told this story before, but he conveniently forgot his release and sent me off into this swamp. It was a mile walk back to the remote island through what he called a little bit thick, but it was basically a solid wall of red brush. And I remember it taking me like an hour and a half to get there. And I got to the island, and I was spent. I was exhausted, full of sweat, thinking, well, how am I even going to hunt this? Got my stuff together, checked the map, snuck around the backside of this island, set up, and the whole time I'm sitting on that island. You need to just worry about the hunt, and if you shoot something, you'll call your buddies, and you'll worry about getting out of there then. I ended up, seeing a doe that night. That was it. Took me, a good hour and a half, 2 hours to get out. I think at one point I might have started crying. No, I don't know, but it was just, walking out of there in the pitch black and through thick, nasty stuff and water. But you do a couple sits and hunts like that, and you start building your confidence that you can go into these areas and get through that kind of stuff and set up and still have a successful hunt.
Yeah.
But I think you got to kind of push yourself past those fear points to do it.
Right. Yeah, and it's obviously
you have a good story to tell.
Quite a bit helpful now too. Obviously, you can use a GPS unit. That'll really boost your confidence on how you're getting out of there in the dark. And then anybody nowadays that has a smartphone has access to multiple platforms for online mapping that have downloadable maps that your phone will use the GPS feature. So even if you do not have cellular service, if you have the map for your area downloaded, you can go as far as to track your entrance right into and then follow that right back out, provided you do not drop your phone into the water or your battery does not go dead. It certainly is, can make life easy. That in combination with a compass and knowing how to use it, you can be in pretty good shape. You can go a lot farther distances than what I typically used to be comfortable going now that I have that ability.
Right. And I think what guys got to realize is that just in doing that, just in kind of pushing past some of those hard points or some of those extreme points to go into spots, you're going to separate yourself from most of the guys that hunt, because they're not going to want to do that. Most of the, a lot of guys want to get down from their tree stand before it gets dark because they want to get back to the truck and get out of the woods before it gets dark. So, just doing little things, because undoubtedly when you're carrying your stand and your sticks in and you're doing these types of hunts, something isn't going to go exactly right as how you planned. But the more practice you get setting up those mobile sets with your hang-on and with your sticks and things like that, you're going to form a pattern. You're going to form a process that you use. The way that you go up the tree, the number of times that you go up the tree, how you set, if you bring a camera arm, how you set your camera arm, how you bring your bow up, how you set your sticks and enter up the tree, you hook on your line. You build and train that pattern that you use. And if you go out on a sit and something doesn't work or something's off, fix it. Don't wait to fix it. Make an adjustment and fix that problem. If you had a loose strap or a loose bolt or something on one of your sticks and it was making noise, fix it. Take care of it and fix it. But on the same flip side, if you didn't have a problem with your equipment or you didn't have a problem with your setup, don't tweak it. Don't over-obsess on tweaking it. Make the changes that you need based on the experience that you have out there in the field. And I think you can sort of rapidly learn what's going on. This hunt... Go ahead.
The maps, too, like I was just talking about, I don't know if that's something that you use. Do you use a GPS? Okay.
So that one's pretty nice because you can bring up Bing Maps, Google Maps, Topo Maps, and you can mark waypoints and record your tracks and everything on there. So that one works pretty good.
Use Onyx Maps. I don't know if you've ever played around with that.
Yep, I've seen that one.
Yeah,
before.
That's a nice one. 'Cause one thing that I found about that I really like is you can mark sign. If you find a rub here, you can drop a little icon. If you find a scrape here, you can drop a little icon. If you find a bed here, you can drop a little icon. Well, we were out scouting on Saturday. By the time we got done, my buddy had, probably dropped 20 markers. And then when you're done and you're out of the woods at the end of the day, you can sit down and look at that. And sometimes you might see a pattern, or something that when you were walking through the woods looking at these, you didn't really pay full attention into until you backed out and looked at it at more of a macro scale, and then you saw, oh wow, look at this whole thing as a travel corridor, or a rub line or something of that nature. And if you're trying to keep mental notes of all that when you're out in the field, a lot of it can get lost, and it can be hard to remember those little details, but those little details can sometimes be pieces of the puzzle. So I found that to be a huge benefit. I think you can download Onyx Maps for basically any phone for $30 for a year for any state, and such a valuable tool too. They show you public and private land parcels. Definitely helpful for knowing where you can go, where you can't go legally, and helping with access. And I've just used it a lot as of lately when I'm trying to do scouting for bedding areas. It's just a huge feature for me, and they have layers that you can lay over that with topo or roads, hybrid modes with different layers, public land, private land. Very valuable tool for $30 for a year, man. It's almost something that I think everybody would use. But I know Dan, he told me he still likes to use paper map and compass, right?
Yeah, but typically, I mean, every hunt that I know Dan goes out on, if it's a property that he's super familiar with where he's going, then he's just going out and hunting it because he's trekked it so many times. He knows. But otherwise, it's starting with a map, an aerial map, and it's looking at the predominant wind for that day, and based on that, it's setting up the plan as to how to go in, based on past experiences. And I think that's another thing that guys should do is start doing a journal. I mean, sometimes you get back from your hunt and you got a lot of other stuff going on, and the journal doesn't seem like the thing that should be top of your mind to do. But another thing that I learned from a lot of these other guys that have a wealth of knowledge in hunting is they journal and they record data on everything. And if you could just take a journal down of the wind when you hunted, the weather conditions, the time of day, what you saw, how, a little map of how your setup was and why, and where you thought the bedding was, and then where you actually saw your sightings. Once you start building up a year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, 5 years of these things, I know guys that have entered that stuff into spreadsheets and start building, patterns off of it if they're hunting specific properties. But they start to pattern deer movement through a specific property. And mature deer, mature animals, they're going to move through a specific property on those patterns year after year after year because there's a reason why they do it. Unless there's some catastrophic event or change in the property, they do it because there's, an efficiency for them doing that. And whether it's food source or proximity to finding doe if it's during the rut, but they're doing it for a specific reason. And you can find those patterns out if you start collecting that data. So I think it's important.
Yeah, and year round too. I mean, this is a year round endeavor, really. I mean, if you're going to go all in on trying to be successful in hunting in this manner, and it's just would be really, really hard to try to retain that much info and not lose track of some items, right?
Yeah. And I think, guys, be patient. You're not going to see, you're probably hunting like this, if you're used to hunting maybe on food sources or food plots or farm fields, whether it be corn or beans or things like this. Typically on field edges, you might see a lot more deer, right? But you're not seeing the deer you want to see. When you start focusing in on bedding and mature buck bedding and trying to get in proximity to those, you might your chance of seeing deer on a regular basis when you do your sits is going to go down. I mean, it's gone down for me. I don't see deer on every sit that I sit, but that's okay, because I'm expecting to see a specific deer or a certain deer that I planned on bedding in that area. So part of it is making that transition. Do you want to see deer, or do you want to try to locate to see the deer that you're after? That's a transition point as well.
Yeah, and that can be people can lose confidence real quickly if they go out a couple times, right, and don't see any deer, and then they might want to, well, I went to this place and at least I saw a couple deer, and you might want to fall back on that, but you might have to try to fight the urge to do that, push through, and as you start to, like you said, grow and get better and better at implementing this, potentially your sightings will start to grow up, and you can grow your confidence in that manner, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, this spring we went out and looked at 7 different public properties that were, back up where I grew up, that I had hunted here and there a couple of times, but we just went back and took a really good, hard look at them and hopped around them to try to find different bedding and as potential spots. I may never get up there and hunt them this year, but we have all the spots marked and have them as options. So I think it's good to get out and do that, to try to look at as many different properties as you can to try to start seeing if you can repeat the patterns that you've had success on another property.
Right.
It just so happens with these swamp and marsh setups, I've been able to have some success setting up on those island points or setting up on those. His latest hunting blog about the first few hunts we had this early season, but Dan has a big pattern that he believes in this first part of the season for shooting a mature whitetail, and it has to do with these remote islands that hold oaks, these white oaks that are dropping acorns, and these big bucks will come into these secluded islands in daylight and eat acorns if they're unharassed. And we had several sits in a number of different locations that we tried out. We tried this theory out. First couple nights, Dan and Jeff G from the site, they had some good sightings and some good encounter with some deer. The places that I sat, I had deer get up and bedding like after dark, but I didn't see any deer on foot. And this past Wednesday, I don't know if you read the blog post at all, but I had an encounter with the second largest buck I've ever seen on hoof on Wednesday night, on this pattern.
I didn't read the blog post, but I believe I watched a YouTube video that's on the Beast channel, right? Are you guys doing a video log of this as well?
Yeah, Dan posted a video on it of all the hunts. So, that hunt, although not successful, was a fun hunt, but it was also a good learning situation. That setup was based some decent bucks in the area based on trail cam pics that we had from the previous season, and just knowledge that we hadn't heard of anyone getting any of these other bucks. Well,